The last part of this lecture is going to focus on sociolinguistics. And sociolinguistics investigates the relationship between social and linguistic variation, or language and its social context. And so we often find that language conventions, language distinctions, mirror the social and economic complexity within a given society. And so sociolinguistics will focus on features that vary systematically with social position and situation. Because we recognize that linguistic change does not occur in a vacuum. And so we are most often going to experience linguistic changes when we are also experiencing social changes. And so this affects things like the linguistic diversity within nations. We find that the ethnic diversity is mirrored by the linguistic diversity. So when we think about the languages that we have present in New Mexico, for example, right? We've got English, we've got Spanish. To a smaller degree, we might have Vietnamese. We might have Arabic. We've got then the Kharisan languages of the Pueblo people, like Tia, Tewa, and Toa, right? So we see very strongly that ethnic diversity and languages that are present and spoken mirror one another. I mean, one of the things that distinguishes cultures from one another, one of the things that perhaps is most significant in making this distinction is differences in languages. All people engage in something that we call style shifts. This is where we use varied speech in different social contexts. When we regularly shift between a high and a low variant, we call that diglossia. Okay, so what do we mean by this? Well, I can speak to German, just given kind of our my husband's cultural traditions and the fact that I learned German to be able to communicate with his parents, um, because his parents were kind of, I mean, as they got older, they were more limited in their kind of English recall and using English to communicate. So in German, there is Hochdeutsch, which is High German. That's the German that you're taught in your language arts classes. Okay. And then there are various different dialects. So there's a dialect in Switzerland called Schweizerdeutsch that uses different words and pronounces some things very differently. So if I were out for a walk and wanted to greet somebody in one of the cities in Germany, right, then I might say something like Guten Tag, or I might just say Tag, which is basically like the equivalent of good day. But in Switzerland, in the German cantons of Switzerland, I'm going to greet people by saying Grüezi, which kind of carries over an element of Italian with it. And so that shifting between formal official language, right, that language that comes with social capital, and dialects of the same language that are used more with, like, let's say, friends and family. You would not write an essay for composition in Spanglish, right? That would be inappropriate and unprofessional. So, the language that you use when you write papers versus the language that you use when you're speaking with friends and family are functionally different. We rank speech patterns as better or worse because we recognize their use by groups that we also rank. And so, when we have a group that we have historically oppressed, we are going to rank people who use that language or that dialect as having lower socioeconomic status. Okay, so one of the areas where this is really critical to acknowledge and discuss is with a dialect of English that is called African American English Vernacular. Okay. And so this factors into our discussion of like Black Lives Matter movement and such. We have historically used language traditions to either prohibit people's access to critical resources or give them greater access to those critical resources. And so our recognition of quote unquote Black language, Black dialects, as being socially inferior, it's a tool. It's a tool that fosters white supremacy. It's a tool that fosters racism, right? And one of the things that anthropology gives us is this uh, culturally relativistic view of the world, right? And so if we're studying language diversity cross culturally, we are poised to recognize that all language systems are equally valid, and that this notion of um, symbolic capital is something that is created kind of within the bounds of dominant prevalent culture, right? So, what are some of the differences that we see, let's say, with different cultures with respect to symbolic capital? Well, we find a lot of gendered speech contrasts. Men and women have differences in their phonology and their grammar, their vocabulary, as well as differences in their body stances and movements that accompany their speech. And so, among traditional Japanese, women tend to adopt an artificially high voice for politeness. In North America and Great Britain, women's speech tends to be more similar to the standard dialect than men's speeches. So women are expected to conform to, they're not supposed to be crass and vulgar, for example. My grandmother would say, or people would say, "Do you speak to your?" My mom would say, "Would you speak to your grandmother in that voice?" If I were like cursing in front of my mom. So, uh, kind of these bounds of propriety. There are some other really interesting things that we see that are gendered speech contrasts. Women use more qualifiers. So I like to ask students this question of who talks more, men or women, right? Most people will say, oh, it's definitely women. It actually isn't. Men actually say more words than women do, but the way that we use language is strategically different. And so women often use language to build rapport and to focus on social relationships, whereas men make reports. Because women are more focused on the kind of maintaining social solidarity and the status quo, they use more qualifiers. What do we mean by qualifiers? Well, we kind of couch our statements with words that minimize the blow or the effect of it. So instead of saying, "You got this answer wrong," I might say something like, well, if I'm interpreting this correctly, we might want to reframe how we think about this. Instead of saying, I'm trying to think of another term there. We say things like, we say, we qualify things as seems to be, appears to be, instead of just making these strong, definitive statements. This is something that I always comment on when I have essays turned in, that one of the best things that people can do to make their writing have more impact is to take out those qualifiers. Don't use passive voice, use active voice. Make strong statements that you then back up with evidence instead of qualifying everything or trying to kind of minimize the potential emotional impact of what you're trying to say. In America, mainstream Americans evaluate the speech of low status groups negatively. William Labov said that pronunciation is clearly associated with prestige. So if you've ever been told to enunciate, right, that's a way of signaling higher status. Our speech habits help determine how others evaluate us. They also then determine our access to employment and other material resources. Pierre Bourdieu said that linguistic practices are symbolic capital, that properly trained people convert into economic and social capital. So this is an area where we need to distinguish between what's fair and right and what just simply is, right? So we do associate language and access to particular dialects of language with social capital. And so this isn't fair. There's no, let's say, reason for this in the sense of we don't have dialects that are inferior, right? So we just have to recognize the way that language gets used strategically. If you want to break out of the bounds of whatever um, subgroup that you might identify with or belong to, one of the ways that you can do that is by changing the way that you speak and changing the way that you write. This is one reason why we say that education is a way out of things like poverty, right? Because part of what you're doing in that education is changing how you write, changing how you talk. So it's not fair, it's not okay that we view different dialects with different um, strategic capital, but it is a pervasive pattern. And it's not only prevalent just in the US, right? So that brings this discussion then to one of the biggest distinctions that we see in America, and that is the distinction between Standard American English and African American English vernacular. The African American English vernacular or vernacular English is a dialect of English that is spoken by the majority of Black youth in inner city urban areas, most rural areas, and is often used in the casual speech of adults, but it's not spoken by all African Americans. There are some pretty clear phonological differences, grammatical differences between African American English vernacular and Standard American English. Specifically, um, the uh, the way that we perhaps use contractions in standard English that doesn't carry over to African American vernacular English. So in standard English, we might say, "You are tired." You are tired. In African American vernacular English, you would simply say, "You tired." He tired. We tired. They tired. There are other syllables that often get dropped out, particularly like R's in the interior of words. Um, we see different pronunciation of things like axe instead of ask. We see the dropping of plural and ed on some of the words that we use. Um, African American vernacular English speakers are less likely to produce the R sound. They use copula deletion to eliminate the verb to be from their speech. And all of this does not make this dialect inferior. When we look at the structure and the function and its effectiveness at communicating, there is no difference between Standard English and African American Vernacular English. However, when we look at the social capital that we ascribe to it, there's a big difference. One show that kind of makes use of this is Everybody Hates Chris, right? That's a good example of some of these speech trends that we see with African American vernacular English. So it is this social capital that we ascribe to these dialects that helps to reinforce years and years of oppression and discrimination. By defining African American vernacular English as somehow inferior to standard American English, we devalue the worth of people who speak that dialect. It's not just this distinction in the United States, right? If we think about other local dialects, right? Like Valley Girl speech from California. If we think about the Southern drawl that people possess from places like the Deep South, right? We ascribe social capital to those things as well. If you hear someone speaking in a deep Southern drawl, you often describe them as slower or kind of somehow less educated. So the way that we speak absolutely gives us differential access to resources, to education, to economics, etc. All right, so one last field of linguistic anthropology is this historical linguistics, right? Culture does not occur in a vacuum. Culture is not static. It doesn't stay the same. Culture is dynamic, and that is true for language as well. So, historical linguistics looks at the study of long term linguistic change. This may feature past languages being reconstructed by studying contemporary daughter languages. Daughter languages are those that descend from the same parent language or proto language, but then have independently been changing for hundreds or even thousands of years. Historical linguists may classify languages according to their degree of relationship. And so we can build taxonomies of language just like we are able to build taxonomies of genetic or evolutionary relatedness. Right. So we can group things into subgroups. So, for example, if you were able to read with the English alphabet, you are also going to be able to read Spanish and French and Italian um, versus something like the Cyrillic alphabet for Russian or the different forms of kanji that are prevalent throughout Eastern Asia. So languages that are similar due to common descent often use like similar alphabets, right? But that close relationship between languages does not always imply that the speakers are closely related biologically or culturally, because people can adopt new languages. And so, particularly with this, with colonialism and imperialism, right, with the European conquests that sought to wipe out indigenous culture in um, much of the rest of the world, right? People adopt those dominant linguistic trends of their colonizers to be able to function. So, in terms of what gets you by in different areas of the world, right? English is useful for speaking in North America and then across some areas or parts of Europe. If you're traveling in sub-Saharan Africa, it's going to be French that's more useful. If you're traveling through South America, in most cases, it's going to be Spanish. That is that common tongue rather than, I mean, though in Brazil, of course, it would be Portuguese, right? So speaking the language of the colonizers is a way to um, kind of fit in this colonial society. And one of the things that colonizers use to erase culture is prohibiting speaking native languages, right? So we have a long history in New Mexico, and not just New Mexico, but United States as a whole, right, of the oppression and erasure of indigenous culture. And one of the mechanisms that was used to basically uh, turn natives into to white people was to prohibit speaking their native language, and Indian schools were used pretty widely to foster that, to erase or quote unquote educate the native out of these children that were brought in from reservations. All right, so anthropologists are interested in historical linguistics because of these cultural features that may correlate with the distribution of language families. Gendered speech, for example, right? English, we don't really think of words as being masculine or feminine, but in Spanish we do. In French we do. In German we do. Another big concern with respect to historical linguistics is language loss. An indigenous language goes extinct when its last speakers die. And when languages disappear, cultural diversity is reduced. We have lost half of the world's linguistic diversity in the past 500 years. There are about 7,000 remaining languages. 20% of those are endangered. Half are expected to disappear within the next century. So we're at a critical juncture. And there are some interesting ways in which anthropologists are trying to kind of document some of these most endangered languages. So David Harrison says that an indigenous language goes extinct as often as every 2 weeks. We can use an example from New Mexico to understand this, right? And that is the fact that we almost lost Navajo as a language tradition, and that was because Navajo was a spoken only language, not a written language. So that made it harder, particularly in light of this cultural practice uh, of forcing Native children to go to school at Western schools, right, Indian schools, there was that danger of losing that cultural heritage. It's what made the Navajo code talkers so useful during World War II, because there wasn't a way of really kind of picking up on that language and learning that language. And so it can take a concerted effort to preserve some of these critically endangered languages. There is a program being done with the Smithsonian that is basically trying to put together a linguistic arc where some of these most critically endangered languages, where they're taking recordings of native speakers and trying to document them and keep them around for in perpetuity, right, through digital audio and video recordings. And so we are able to make linguistic trees much like we are able to make phylogenetic trees when we're looking at evolutionary relatedness, right? So this is the family tree of the Indo-European languages that can all be traced back to a proto-language that we called Proto-Indo-European. This then split into dialects that evolved into separate daughter languages, which then evolved into granddaughter languages like Latin, Proto-Germanic, etc., that were ancestral to dozens of modern languages. So, studying this historical basis for historical context of language can be quite useful. So, in summary, be able to understand the structure and nature of animal communication and how it differs from human communication, this basis of call systems versus actual language. Be familiar with nonverbal forms of communication, like gestures, facial expressions, and body movements. Consider how these might form an interwoven part of spoken language. Be able to identify the interrelated levels of organization in language between phonemes, morphemes, lexicon, and syntax. Be able to, or be familiar with the central premise of Chomsky's idea of universal grammar, as well as that of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Know what distinguishes a focal vocabulary and be able to identify the subject matter of semantics. Know what sociolinguists study. Understand how social difference is organized and maintained through specific situated linguistic practices. Even as fundamentally social linguistic practices are differently valued and evaluated, what does this concept of linguistic relativity assert? Know what African American vernacular English is and how it compares to standard American English, and know what historical linguists study and how their work contributes to anthropology as a whole.